Today we're going to be talking to Edwin Newman, NBC News correspondent, critic, commentator, and author of 2 books, Strictly Speaking, and I might say I have a very dog-eared paperback to represent Strictly Speaking, and his newest book, A Civil Tongue. Thank you, Mr. Newman, for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to get to your books very quickly, but first, recently on NBC, you moderated a program on hype. For those who may not have seen Hype, or what was it, the world of hype, the land of hype?
We called it Land of Hype and Glory.
Can you explain what hype is briefly? Because everyone certainly is hyped, whether they know it or not.
Well, hype is promotion, I think. Hype is exaggeration. We defined it as a shot in the arm, and in fact the derivation of the word, from everything I can learn, although some indignant people have told me I'm wrong about this, the derivation of the word is from hypodermic, meaning a shot of something under the skin. And that's how we defined hype, as an attempt to make something seem bigger than it is, faster, livelier, more exciting, more thrilling than it is. And we dealt with it in rock music, in publishing of books, and in the movies.
Right, you left out...
And also a bit on television.
Advertising, I noticed.
Well, we did have advertising in it. Advertising is a form of hype. Actually, what is interesting about hype is that it is sometimes original, it's sometimes outrageous. Some of it is just routine, and most advertising has been going on for so long and so incessantly that much of the hype in advertising is routine, and people just take it for granted. So to attract attention, the hype has to have something larger than the routine exaggeration.
Exaggerated, and actually sometimes just creating a specific...
Well, we took as an example, the rock group KISS. KISS is a marvelous example of hype because so little of what hype does, so little of the success of KISS, I'm confusing KISS and hype, so the success of KISS depends to such a small extent on its music. Its success depends to such a great extent on the hype that is associated with the music.
The theatrics that surround them, and usually done just for the benefit of publicity, not...
So that one way in which you could define this hype would be to measure the content and measure the package in which the content is wrapped. The smaller the package, the smaller the content, the larger the package, the greater the hype. Maybe I ought to say that again.
Well, KISS seems like a very small bit of very little content in a huge package. You interviewed them, didn't you?
I did. I found them very amiable, and they, of course, they're tremendously successful and have a great deal to be amiable about since they've become millionaires, or something very close to millionaires, and they're young men, all of them.
I was
average age about 30.
30. Appealing to what age, would you say?
Well, part of the technique is to appeal to a rather large age group, going down even to the people who wouldn't be ready for their music, but who would be ready for their comic strip books. So I would say that the concerts would appeal to people in the teens and early 20s, but that they reach down, let's say in the upper teens, but that they reach down into the lower teens. And I had a couple of telephone calls not long ago from 2 10-year-olds who wanted me to help them get autographs from KISS.
From KISS? Are they in blood? Because they vomit blood on stage? How do
one of them vomits, spits out, I suppose, since it isn't genuine, what appears to be blood, and I assume it is not blood. In any case, it isn't. If it is,
isn't his blood anyway.
It's been taken from outside and put inside, so that it can again be vomited forth. That's an old theatrical technique. There was, for decades, possibly for centuries, a celebrated acting company in Paris called the Grand Guignol, which specialized in this kind of thing. You'd go to see a performance by the Grand Guignol, and you might see what appeared to be a hairpin driven into somebody's eye, or you'd see somebody guillotined on the stage, apparently. This is old stuff, but isn't often used in connection with rock music.
Well, now they told you, I guess you might have asked the question, what is the meaning? Why are you doing this? And they said there isn't any meaning. The only meaning is that we're doing it.
That's right.
Do you agree with them?
It's very hard for me to know what the meaning is, what the appeal of this is.
That's it. What's the meaning to those who are watching?
The theory that the KISS people put forward is that they're presenting characters who are larger than life, somewhat romantic in that sense, and that therefore they have become heroes or even superheroes to the people who watch them. Well, those are large words, and I'm not sure that they mean a great deal. I'm not entirely certain what it's all about. Rock music is, to some extent anyway, I ought to say, a mystery to me. It seems to me...
You're a classical fan, aren't you?
Well, I like jazz as well.
You do?
I do find rock music occasionally interesting, but for the most part I find it extremely monotonous and limited. So just what its appeal is, I find it hard to know. There does seem to be a great desire on the part of many young people, not only in this country, to have their ears assaulted. The louder the assault, the better. The more outrageous the performance and the less genuine musicality in it, the better. Now, what it is they're rebelling against, it's very hard to see, but obviously it's rebellion of some kind. A very profitable one for some people.
Very profitable. And seems to be continuing.
It is continuing, and what I suppose is predictable, and this is also true of hype generally, what is predictable is that as it continues, it will have to be more and more outrageous until it finally collapses. But each group will have to surpass the group that preceded it. In outrageousness, there is a performer, I'm told, who throws himself on broken glass on the stage. Where you go from that, I don't know, but I came up with a theory a while ago that the day would come when a rock group would announce that it would machine gun its audience from the stage, and people would still turn up.
They probably would. Well, there is a, quote, artist already who had himself shot in the shoulder and then exhibited the bullet. Really? I believe in the Whitney Museum.
Really?
That's where the so-called arting, as the professor mentioned in your civil tongue, the art professor mentioned
It would be interesting to know if that was done at the Whitney Museum. What artistic...
No, I don't think it was done at the Whitney, but I think it was exhibited there.
If the Whitney Museum exhibited it, or indeed if any museum exhibited it, what artistic content the museum thought that bullet had?
Well, about the same artistic content of a lot of the work at the Whitney. I don't want to stay on hype too long, but you had a short film clip of yourself. You included yourself in the section on publishers hyping books.
Yes.
How do you feel hyping your own books, especially after doing the program?
Well, I thought in that case, since I was speaking about the hyping of books, that I ought to make it clear that I was not speaking from a position above the battle, and that I wasn't trying to be superior to anybody, and I do, after all, go out and autograph books. And I recognize that one reason people buy my books is that I am on television and they know me, and it gives me an advantage. I don't mind doing it. I find people generally are kind, and they seem quite pleased that I should turn up, which seems to me exaggerated on their part. Why shouldn't I? I'm doing it in my own interest. But they seem to think it's gracious of me to autograph the books, and of course it isn't at all. It seems to be now, for the great majority of authors, a necessary act to do publicity in connection with your book, provided the publisher thinks it's worth spending the money. For most authors, publishers feel
that
it's a waste.
Definitely.
There's no point in sending them out. But
right.
If the author is well enough known, he or she will be sent out, provided he or she is willing to do it. I remember meeting the author Michael Crichton, who has recently become a movie director and wrote The Andromeda Strain, among other books. He told me he would not go out. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't appear on television and radio programs, but there are very few authors to whom the offer is made who can afford to say no.
The Andromeda Strain, however, was certainly hyped despite his lack of appearance. You worked very hard. I guess you wrote the program and had a great deal to do with it. Does it bother you that, unlike a book, a television program that you may have worked weeks or months on is seen once and probably won't be seen again, whereas a book is going to be around forever?
It does bother me. I think, and I'm not at all responsible for financial decisions and never have been, and I've never had to sell any time on the air, and I've never been dependent on advertisers, and I've never had to worry about ratings. I don't know how to read a rating sheet, and I think it's a good protection not to be able to. So it's easy for me to say these things. I don't do the accounting and present the reports to the shareholders, but it does seem to me that there are programs that ought to be repeated, even if on the second time around you're going to get a smaller audience. I think there are programs that are well worth repeating, that have educational value and entertainment value, and that it's silly to put them on once. There are, granted that conditions may be different, there are certainly networks overseas that are in the habit of putting on programs more than once.
Well, even public television here repeats a program many times.
BBC, for example, repeats programs as a matter of course. And it ought to be possible, it seems to me, to repeat them, perhaps not necessarily in prime time, but I think they ought to be put on.
Does it bother you, though, that your work, as a newscaster, your work is gone as soon as you do it? It's probably not even kept
That doesn't bother me.
But that a body of your work is probably has a one-night appearance and that's it.
Well,
you like books better for that reason.
Many of us in television news came out of newspaper work. I did.
Which is just as ephemeral.
And wire service work, and it isn't quite as ephemeral, but very nearly, because files are kept of newspapers, though it's doubtful that anybody looks in them. But even then you would hear newspaper people say that they wanted to write books because books had a lasting value. I feel that way. I feel that it is a more considerable achievement to have written a book, but I realize that that has something to do with the generation of which I am a member, and it is possible that that's a view that's changing.
Maybe. I agree with you. I do think, I mean, at least a book has some sort of permanence. Also, it's your own, which entirely, which of course must make a difference.
We find a book more impressive than a program, even though the program may be seen by many times more people than will read the book.
Let's get to a civil tongue. What is a civil tongue?
Well, a civil tongue is, I mean by civil tongue, and I think I say this at the outset of the book, a language that is straightforward, that is concrete, that is specific. It may be eloquent if eloquence is called for, and it may be elegant and subtle if those qualities are called for. It may be, it should be appropriate to the emotion and to the occasion. What it should not be is pompous, bombastic, affected. It ought not to be the polysyllabic, pretentious language that comes from so much of government and so much of the academic world. It also ought to be, to the extent possible, grammatical. I realize one has to recognize that there are people who don't speak grammatically, have not had the education necessary to enable them to do it. But that ought not to be encouraged, and it ought not to be glorified, and there are people now who are glorifying ungrammatical English.
Wouldn't you, though? You have some wonderful examples of bureaucratic language, jargon in your book, and I guess you have some here.
I have some new ones.
Do you? Wouldn't you rather? I'm sure you get piles and piles of material every day in the mail. Wouldn't you rather have ungrammatical but colorful language?
Indeed, I would. Indeed, I would.
This bureaucratic malaise that's
yes,
just...
and I don't mean at all that ungrammatical language cannot be colorful and lucid and vivid and forceful. It can. Some of it is marvelous. And I think of examples. One of my favorite examples had to do with an interview that I saw in England. I think it was the BBC, it may have been the other network, ITV. Had sent a reporter around. It looked as though there was going to be an election. And the reporter was going around asking people whether they wanted to have an election. And the reporter went to a coal mine. As miners came out, he interviewed one of them. He said, "Do you want an election?" It was a conservative government in power. The miner said, "Yes." He said, "Why do you want an election?" The miner said, "To get the buggers out." you can't say it any more specifically than that. I was in a veterans hospital. I was a patient for a while, nothing very interesting. And there was another patient who noticed a new patient who had come in, and he said to me, "What does he do?" I said, "He's a teacher." The first patient said, "Them is my chief dread." You can't say it more succinctly than that.
I had one that I've always loved. Actually, she's a good friend of mine, and she may murder the King's English, but in speaking of a realtor up where I live, she said, "If you walk in his office, you'd better have your eye teeth cut and be ready for a roll." And I prefer that kind of color.
Well, I do too. Let me give you an example. This came to me from Virginia, where there was an election to fill a vacancy in the state Senate. Two candidates. The one who lost was explaining on the radio why he lost. And what he should have said was, "My opponent was better known than I." Instead of which he said that his opponent had greater name recognition strength. Now this is the kind of jargon that has spread so far.
It's really drowning us, isn't it?
It is. I picked up a story a while ago about, it's come from San Francisco, where a highway collapsed, but the Department of Transportation investigators didn't want to say that the highway collapsed or caved in or fell in or whatever sensible term would be appropriate. They said that the highway or freeway had lost its structural integrity. Now that has a technical ring to it and makes it all sound much more complicated. And
do they do that for a reason?
Well, they do it. Indeed, they do it for a reason. They do it precisely for the reason that it makes everything that they're talking about sound much more difficult. It makes it sound as though some special knowledge is required to understand it. And this is a way of protecting your job. It's a way of making what you do sound important to yourself and to other people. And it keeps other people from questioning what you're doing because it sounds as though some special knowledge is needed to understand it. We had a case in January in Chicago of some girders on the elevated structure that cracked. And I consulted a professor about this, and the professor in the Illinois Institute of Technology, I think he was, said, "All we can say is that we're very, very lucky that this was caught before it went into the catastrophic mode." They caught it before it broke.
Right.
So yes, indeed, there's a reason. There certainly is a reason people use language of that kind.
Do you see this increasing or decreasing since your books came out? Have they had any effect?
Yes, I think they have. I think there's evidence of a change. There's a good deal of evidence. President Carter has said that he wants plain English used in the federal government, and an executive order has been in the works.
Wanting and getting are two different
yes,
things.
Yes, I agree, but an executive order has been in the works for some time that will require regulations in plain English. There have been some laws, state laws, requiring contracts to be written in plain English. Laws about which I must say there is some debate, because there is a question as to whether you can put certain contracts into plain English without legal consequences, given the fact that contracts have been written and not in plain English for so very long. But in addition to Carter's order, you do now have a number of people in the federal government who insist on plain English. The head of the Civil Aeronautics Board has become almost a hero nationally because of his order on this point. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the head of the FCC. This is spreading. There are banks and insurance companies that boast now in their advertising that their policies can be read and understood. There's even a company here in New York that specializes in putting corporate language into in understandable terminology. Terms.
They must have a burgeoning
They have a big business, a big and burgeoning business.
How do you feel knowing that in some way you are responsible for turning the tide? Because indeed I think you are the first person who came out, tackled it, and your book became a bestseller as a result of it.
Well, if I did have something to do with it, and I'm reasonably certain that I did, I'm quite certain that I did, I have reason to be happy and proud. I noticed, for example, far more ridicule of this kind of language than I have ever seen before. I find it in newspapers, I find wire service stories about it, I find magazine stories about it, I find books about it. And I think that probably has a good deal to do with what I wrote, because it's a method of attacking this language that I use.
You were the first person to dare to attack it so thoroughly, weren't you?
I'm not certain of that, but I think possibly may have had something to do with the quality of the books. I don't know, I'd like to think so, but also probably because I was well known as a result of being on television. When I did it, it attracted much more attention. I was, to some extent, well known and nationally, and so the books were reviewed very widely, probably more than would have been the case if they'd been written by somebody who was not as well known as I.
Aren't you glad you could use that to get the message out?
Indeed I am.
You give some very funny examples in A Civil Tongue of several things, mixed metaphors, and I guess you don't like the word malapropisms. You didn't use it.
Well, I like the word malapropism. I have great affection for Mrs. Malaprop and Madam Malaprop.
Couldn't you write a play with the 20th century Mrs. Malaprop?
I think you could do it within limits. The problem you run into there is where you're mixing metaphors and and having a character making mistakes deliberately. I think it's a technique that tends to wear thin. For example, this one came from my wife. Somebody spoke of a low abundance. Now, in a sense, that's a malapropism, because if it's an abundance, it can't be low. It is also a bureaucratic jargon, a social scientific jargon, and rather than saying we have very little of this or only a small amount of this, they will say we have a low abundance of it. I heard of a politician who didn't want to say that he had a low regard for someone or didn't think much of someone. He said he had a minimum high regard for him.
Well, that's just redundant. Well, it is.
It's nonsense.
It's nonsense. You had several in your book. You had, she was in eminent danger.
She was in eminent danger.
And you must be imperious rather than impervious to these things. Mrs. Malaprop in the 18th century asked Lydia to alliterate her lover from her memory. I think you'd be great writing a play.
Well, thank you. Maybe.
Have you considered it? Because you were a drama critic for many years.
Well, perhaps drama critics ought not to write plays. It'd be too vulnerable. I did try to write plays when I was younger, and they didn't get anywhere, I must say. And I doubt that I ever will again try it.
Have you ever wanted to do something that you've reported on? I mean, you report on the entire world. Have you ever wanted to get in there and be a politician at least for a day and get the job done the way you think it should be done, or write a play after seeing what you consider a great play?
I have some desire to write a novel, and I may try that. But I did behave as a politician once. We did a program called Somehow It Works about the American political system. That's not my phrase, it was David Brinkley's. He was trying to explain the American political system to a British audience, and it was a term he used. But we did a program about the American electoral system, in which I pretended to be running for president. And I had posters made and balloons made and the like, and generally carried on as though I were a candidate. And I think somebody recommended, I think it was Kurt Vonnegut, recommended that I become a senator from New York, which I took to be a compliment.
Have you ever been tempted?
No.
No.
I think it's difficult to be a politician. It's a lot easier to be a commentator.
Do you have something, aside from writing a novel, that you would really like to do that you haven't done?
No, I think I've been very fortunate, really. I've had a great variety of assignments over the years, and I can, to some extent, choose the assignments I take now, and I think I've been fortunate. I don't feel I've been deprived of anything in my work, and I've managed to write a couple of books, both of which did well and appear to have had some effect. So, no, I think I've been lucky.
Can you describe the process? Your books were very successful. Strictly Speaking was on the bestseller list for a number of...
6 months.
6 months.
Yes, and
Can you
civil
describe...
time for somewhat less.
Can you describe the process of, perhaps before you'd even gotten the book published, aspiring to have it on the bestseller list, watching it go up the ladder and then slowly back down again?
It's well, that is a strange experience to begin with. If you're writing a book, I think this would apply to the vast majority of writers. You don't think it'll ever get on the bestseller list, and you think, gee, if I could just get on once, even number 10 at the bottom, just for 1 week, I'd be happy and I'd be proud, and I probably wouldn't even be able to describe my feelings. Then, as your book becomes a bestseller, your view changes radically. You make the bestseller list and you begin to feel that you're entitled to stay on it more or less indefinitely, and you begin, perhaps I shouldn't say you, perhaps I should say I don't know whether this is true of all authors, I suspect it is, you begin to look out for books that might knock you off.
Do you read the new publication list very, very carefully?
You look at the reviews of books that are more recent than yours, and you wonder which ones are doing well. I never went to the extent of looking at Publishers Weekly to see what the figures were for other books, but you're certainly aware of the existence of other books that might knock you off the list, and you resent them.
You do resent them?
You do.
The more your book then slowly falls off the list, as indeed it much, the more you resent it? Other books?
Once it starts to go down, I think that softens the blow. You see, there's a further complication in all this, and that is that with many books, when the paperback rights to the hardcover book are sold, the amount for which the paperback rights are sold may be affected by the length of time the book has been on the bestseller list in hardcover and its position on the list. The higher the position, the larger the addition to the price of the paperback rights. So as you see a book falling off the list, it means not only are the hardcover sales going down, but the price of the paperback rights is not going down, but it is no longer going up.
But at least you know the paperback's coming out. Thank you for being our guest today on Personality. We've been talking to Edwin Newman. His books are Strictly Speaking and A Civil Tongue. Have a good week.